The promise of rain was a lie the sky had been telling for months. Dust, fine as powdered bone, settled on everything, on the cracked plank porch of her father's house, on the drooping heads of her mother's withered sunflowers, and on the shoulders of the simple gray dress Ellen wore for her wedding day. It was not the dress of a bride. It was the dress of a sacrifice. Her father, a good man broken by 2 seasons of drought and a bad bet on a strain of wheat that failed, could not look her in the eye. He had spent the morning staring at the deed to their farm, the paper now bearing the crisp, arrogant signature of Walter Briggs. The debt was settled. The price was his daughter. Ellen stood beside the man who now owned her, her hand resting limply in the crook of his arm. Walter Briggs was a man carved from the harsh land itself. He was twice her age, broad and thick, with a face weathered by sun and a temper that was the stuff of local legend. His wealth was as vast as the plains his cattle roamed, and his cruelty was just as wide and open. He had seen Ellen in town once, her hair the color of sun-cured hay, and had decided he wanted her, in this part of the country, what a man like Walter Briggs wanted. He simply took. The wedding took place in Redemption Gulch, a town whose name felt like a bitter joke. It was little more than a single dusty street flanked by sun-bleached buildings that leaned against each other for support. The wind, a constant, mournful presence, whipped grit into their faces as they stood before the preacher. The preacher was a young man, his eyes full of a helpless pity that was almost harder to bear than the cold triumph in Walter's. He stumbled over the words, his voice thin against the ceaseless howl of the wind. Ellen felt nothing. A strange and terrible emptiness had hollowed her out, leaving only a shell that could stand and nod and whisper, "I do," when prompted. She watched a tumbleweed skitter across the street, a frantic, aimless dance, and felt a kinship with it. She saw her mother clutch a handkerchief to her mouth, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. She saw her younger brother, Thomas, his face pale with a confusion that would soon curdle into understanding. And she saw her father, his hands clenched into useless fists at his sides, his gaze fixed on the horizon as if searching for a salvation that would never come. When the preacher finally said, "You may kiss the bride," Walter's grip on her arm tightened. His lips were dry and firm, a sealing of a contract, devoid of any tenderness. It was not a kiss, it was a branding. The journey back to her family's farm was silent. The air in the small wagon was thick with unspoken grief and shame. When they arrived, Walter did not dismount. He remained on his stallion, a dark silhouette against the failing light. "Her things," he said, his voice flat and impatient. Her father carried out the small wooden chest that held all her worldly possessions. 3 worn dresses, a comb made of bone, a tattered book of poems, and the small, smooth stone she had carried in her pocket since she was a girl. He set it on the ground, the sound a dull thud of finality. Her mother approached the wagon, her face a mask of sorrow. "Be good, Ellen," she whispered, her voice breaking. It was all she could offer, a plea for her daughter to be compliant, to be quiet, to survive. Ellen nodded, the emptiness inside her so vast she could not summon a single tear. She hugged her mother, feeling the frailness of her bones. She looked at her father, who finally met her gaze. In his eyes, she saw a lifetime of regret being born in that single, terrible moment. He had saved his land but lost his soul. Then they turned away. Her father helped her mother onto the wagon seat, and with a flick of the reins, they were gone, leaving a cloud of dust to hang in the air like a ghost. They left her behind, alone on the porch of the Briggs ranch house with her new husband and the crushing silence of the plains. Walter's ranch was a testament to his ambition. The main house was a 2-story structure of imposing timber, a giant in a land of scrub and rock, but inside, it was cold and joyless. The furniture was heavy and dark, the floors bare and echoing. There were no pictures on the walls, no colorful quilts on the beds, no sign that a woman had ever lived there. It was a fortress, not a home, and she was its prisoner. Life fell into a bleak and suffocating routine. Walter's cruelty was not a thing of loud shouts or sudden blows. Not at first. It was a slow, methodicno strangulation of her spirit. It began with the rules. She was not to leave the house without his permission. She was not to ride out onto the property alone. The gray dress she had been married in was deemed too plain, and he presented her with a bolt of dark, severe wool. "A rancher's wife should look respectable," he'd said, his eyes lingering on her in a way that made her skin crawl. He controlled her words as much as her movements. If a ranch hand tipped his hat and offered a polite, "Good morning, Mrs.," Walter would be there, his presence a silent warning. He would question her later, his voice low and menacing. "What did Jebediah want? A man like that has no business speaking to you." She learned to keep her eyes downcast, to offer only clipped, necessary responses, to make herself as small and unnoticeable as possible. Her world shrank to the four walls of the house, the dusty patch of land out back she tried to coax into a garden, and the vast, indifferent sky. The ranch was an island in a sea of dry, cracked earth. Miles of open land stretched in every direction, offering no comfort, only a profound sense of isolation. The horizon was a hard, straight line that promised nothing but more of the same. The wind never stopped. It rattled the window panes, moaned through the eaves, and shrieked through the broken slats of the fences that bordered the property. It was a constant, lonely sound, the voice of her own despair given breath. Some nights, she would lie awake and listen to it, imagining it was the world screaming for her. One evening, nearly a month into her marriage, the monotony was broken by the sound of approaching horses. It was late, the sun having long since bled out across the western sky, leaving behind a bruised, purple twilight. Ellen was in the kitchen, finishing the mending of one of Walter's shirts by the weak light of a kerosene lamp. She heard Walter's heavy boots on the porch, followed by the low murmur of men's voices. Peeking through the window, she saw a group of 5 riders silhouetted against the deepening dark. New hands. The ranch was always in need of men willing to trade their sweat and blood for a few dollars and a bunk in the barn. Walter came inside, a foul mood clinging to him like the scent of whiskey on his breath. "Got some new men," he grunted, not looking at her. "See that cook has breakfast for them before dawn. They start on the north fence tomorrow." He disappeared into his study, the heavy thud of the closing door punctuating her dismissal. The next morning, Ellen saw the new men from a distance as she fed the chickens. They were a rough-looking collection, hard-bitten and weary from the trail. Most were loud and boastful, their laughter coarse as they settled into the familiar rhythms of ranch work. But one man stood apart from the others. He was quieter, leaner, with a way of moving that was economical and sure. There were scars on his face, a faded white line that cut through one eyebrow and a deeper, more jagged one that traced his jawline. He did not join in the loud talk of the others, content to observe from the periphery. His name, she learned from the cook, was Caleb Holt. Caleb did not try to speak to her. He barely seemed to notice her at all. Yet she felt his eyes on her sometimes, as she worked in her small, struggling garden, trying to nurture life from the unforgiving soil. She would feel a prickling on her skin and look up to see him across the yard, mending a harness or sharpening a tool, his gaze thoughtful before it flickered away. From his own silent distance, Caleb saw more than anyone else. He saw the faint, purple bruise hidden beneath her sleeve when she reached up to pin a stray piece of hair. He saw the slight, almost imperceptible flinch when Walter's shadow fell over her. He saw the way she spoke to the horses, her voice soft and gentle, a tone he never heard her use with any person. He watched her tend to the small garden Walter openly mocked, coaxing green shoots from the parched earth with a patience that was a form of prayer. He saw her fear. Yes, it was plain as the dust on his boots, but beneath it, He saw a strength that bent but had not yet broken. He saw something beautiful and wild trapped behind the bars of her eyes, a spirit that belonged to the open plains, not to the cold, dark house on the hill. He had drifted through enough ranches and towns to know the scent of trouble. He recognized the look in Walter Briggs's eyes, a possessive, brittle pride that could shatter into violence at the slightest provocation. A smart man, a man who wanted to live to see another sunrise, kept his head down and his mouth shut. Caleb Holt considered himself a smart man. He was just passing through, earning a stake to move on. Getting involved in the affairs of a rancher and his pretty, sad-eyed wife was a fool's game. So he said nothing. He kept his distance, his face a mask of indifference. But he watched. One night, Ellen could not sleep. The wind was particularly relentless, clawing at the house like a living thing. The air was thick with a tension she could taste, a feeling that something was about to break. Walter was in town, a rare reprieve that left the house feeling both empty and, paradoxically, even more menacing in its silence. She rose from her bed and went to the window, wrapping her arms around herself against the chill that had nothing to do with the night air. The moon was high and full, washing the desolate landscape in a stark, silver light. The world outside was a study in black and silver, beautiful and lonely. Her gaze drifted from the endless plains to the corrals, to the dark shape of the barn, and then she saw him. Caleb Holt was standing near the water trough, a good distance from the house. He was not looking toward her window. His back was mostly to her. He stood perfectly still, a solitary figure bathed in moonlight, looking out at the same immense, empty darkness that she did. He took a slow drag from a hand-rolled cigarette, the small orange ember flaring for a moment before fading. He was just standing there, a silent sentinel under the vast, uncaring sky. He was not there for her. He was a stranger, a scarred and quiet cowboy who likely did not know her name. Yet, in that moment, watching him stand there in the lonely quiet of the night, a silent witness to the same desolation that surrounded her, a strange and unfamiliar feeling stirred in the hollow space inside her chest. For the first time since her family's wagon had disappeared into a cloud of dust, Ellen did not feel completely, terrifyingly alone. The sight of Caleb Holt standing under the moonlight had not brought Ellen hope. Not exactly. Hope was a fragile, delicate thing, and she knew the Briggs Ranch was no place for it to grow. What it had brought her was a crack in the suffocating wall of her solitude. It was the knowledge that another soul was awake and watchful in the vast, sleeping darkness. That knowledge, small as it was, became a seed, and in the barren soil of her life, she began to tend to it. Her defiance started in ways so small that even a man as obsessively controlling as Walter Briggs would not notice. Not at first. She began taking over the feeding of the horses herself. The cook, a weary woman named Martha, was grateful to be spared the chore, and Walter cared little who did the work as long as it was done. For Ellen, it was more than a task. It was a communion. She loved the soft velvet of their noses, the warm, sweet scent of their breath, the gentle way they would nuzzle her palm in search of a stray oat. They did not judge her. They did not threaten her. Their presence was simple and honest, a balm to her frayed spirit. She would whisper to them, telling them about the weather, about the ache in her back, about the dreams she could no longer remember upon waking. They were the only living things she could speak to without fear. She took to writing letters. She had no one to send them to, and no way to send them if she did. They were written on scraps of wrapping paper she saved from the mercantile. Using a small nub of a pencil she kept hidden in a crack in the hearth, she wrote to her mother, to her brother Thomas, and, sometimes, to a version of herself that no longer existed, a girl who had once dreamed of a small house with blue shutters and a life filled with love, not fear. She wrote of the wind, of the silence, of the way Walter's eyes followed her around a room. She poured all the words she could not speak onto the page, and then, with trembling hands, she would fold the letters and hide them beneath a loose floorboard under her bed. The small stack of papers became a testament to her survival. Proof that the woman inside the quiet, obedient wife was still alive. The gold band on her finger felt heavier each day. Sometimes, when she was kneading dough or washing linens, she would touch it, and a strange heat would seem to pulse from it, a phantom burn that traveled up her arm. It was a brand, a constant, physical reminder of her bondage. More and more. She found herself twisting it, pulling at it, a nervous habit that she had to consciously stop whenever Walter was near. The ring was not a symbol of a sacred vow. It was the cold, hard link of a chain. Caleb Holt, in his quiet way, became a fixed point in her daily landscape. He never approached her directly, never offered a greeting that might draw Walter's ire. Yet his presence was a constant, subtle support. One blistering afternoon, as she struggled back from the well with 2 heavy buckets of water, her arms straining and her back screaming in protest, she set them down to rest. When she looked up, Caleb was there. He said nothing. He simply picked up one of the buckets and carried it to the kitchen door for her, his face impassive. He set it down, gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, and walked away before she could even form a word of thanks. Another time, the latch on the chicken coop broke, and she was forced to prop a heavy stone against the flimsy door to keep predators out. She mentioned it to Walter, who merely grunted and said he would tell one of the men to fix it when they had time. Days passed, and the stone remained. Then one morning, she went out to find a new, sturdy iron latch gleaming on the door, fitted perfectly. She knew, with a certainty that needed no proof, who had put it there. He never lingered, never stared, but when their paths did cross in the dusty yard, he would meet her gaze, his eyes, a startlingly clear gray in his sun-weathered face, held no pity. They held something else, something deeper. It was a look of acknowledgement, a silent communication that said, "I see you," in a world where she felt invisible. That brief, steady glance was as vital as air. Word of Walter Briggs's temper was nothing new to the surrounding territories, but now it had a new focus, on her rare, supervised trips into Redemption Gulch for supplies. Ellen felt the stares of the townspeople. The women would fall silent as she passed, their whispers following her like the dust kicked up by her husband's boots. She heard the words once, a fragment carried on the wind as she waited outside the mercantile. "The quiet wife in the big house." The name settled over her like a shroud. They did not see Ellen Dawson. They saw a possession, a mystery, a tragedy to be whispered about over sewing circles and saloon bars. They saw Mrs. Briggs, a woman who lived in a fine house but whose eyes held the haunted look of a prisoner. The quiet cruelty of her life finally shattered into open violence over the smallest of creatures. A stray dog, a scruffy bundle of bones and matted fur with one eye clouded over, had appeared at the edge of the property. It was starved and injured, its back leg held at an unnatural angle. Ellen, her heart aching at the sight of its misery, began leaving scraps of food for it near the old shed, far from the main house. For a week, it was her secret. The dog, whom she called Scraps in her mind, slowly began to trust her, eventually allowing her to clean its wound and set the broken leg with a crude splint. It was the first creature she had been able to truly care for, to heal. In nursing the broken animal, she felt a piece of her own brokenness begin to mend. Walter found them one afternoon. He came around the side of the shed, his face darkening with a terrible fury as he saw her kneeling in the dirt, gently stroking the dog's head as it licked broth from a bowl. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice dangerously low. Ellen scrambled to her feet. "He was hurt, Walter, starving. I was just—" "You were wasting my food on a filthy mongrel," he snarled, his eyes cold and hard as river stones. "Get in the house." "Please," she begged, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. "He's no bother. I'll keep him out of the way. I give the orders on this ranch. Woman, not you." and I will not have my wife groveling in the dirt with the vermin." He took a step toward the dog, which let out a low, fearful growl. "Now," Walters said, his voice dropping to a whisper that was more terrifying than any shout. "Get in the house." She stumbled backward, her heart hammering against her ribs. She wanted to scream, to fight, to throw herself in front of the helpless animal, but she was frozen by the cold. Absolute certainty of the violence in his eyes. Defying him now would not save the dog, and it would bring a wrath upon her that she could not bear to imagine. Her legs, moving against her will, carried her toward the house. She did not look back. She made it to the porch, her hands gripping the railing. When the shot rang out, the sound was flat and final, echoing across the plains, a single sharp crack that severed the last thread of hope inside her. She sank to her knees, a dry, ragged sob tearing from her throat. There were no tears. The grief was too deep, too cold for that. It was a freezing wave that washed through her, hardening her heart into something brittle and sharp. In the echoing silence after the gunshot, her silent weeping turned into a quiet, unyielding rebellion. He had not just killed a dog. He had tried to kill her compassion, and she would not let him. From the hayloft of the barn, Caleb Holt had seen the whole thing. He had seen her secret kindness, and he had seen Walter's brutal response. When the shot came, he felt it in his own gut, a sickening lurch of fury and helplessness. Later that night, long after the house had gone dark, he heard a sound from the barn below. It was the sound of someone trying, and failing, to cry in silence. He knew it was her. She had fled the cold prison of the house for the relative comfort of the barn, seeking solace among the quiet animals. His first instinct was to go to her, to climb down from the loft, to put a hand on her shoulder, to offer some small, inadequate word of comfort. His body tensed, his muscles ready to move, but he stopped himself. What could he say? What could he do? Briggs would kill him for even speaking to her in such a state, and his comfort would be a fleeting thing, a single drop of rain on a parched and burning field. It would only make the returning drought harder to bear for her. It was a dangerous, selfish impulse, torn between a desperate desire to ease her suffering and the cold, hard logic of survival. He remained in the shadows of the hayloft, listening to her quiet, broken sobs until they finally faded into an exhausted silence. The sound of her pain would haunt him for a long time to come. 2 weeks later, the sky, which had been a merciless, brassy bowl for months, turned a bruised greenish black. The wind, usually a constant moan, fell eerily silent. A storm was coming, a real plains gully washer. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with a nervous energy that mirrored the tension in Ellen's own heart. When the rain finally came, it was not gentle. It fell in hard, driving sheets, turning the dusty yard into a churning sea of mud. Thunder cracked overhead, loud enough to shake the very foundations of the house, and lightning bleached the world white for a split second at a time. Walter, who had no love for storms, took a bottle of whiskey and shut himself in his study. "See to the house," he'd ordered Ellen, already slurring his words. A frantic shout from one of the ranch hands brought her to the door. "The north pen's given way, missus! The cattle are spooked!" Through the deluge, she could see chaos. A section of the cattle pen, weakened by the wind and rain, had collapsed. The terrified animals were beginning to scatter, their bellowing lost in the roar of the storm. The ranch hands were scrambling, but they were too few to handle the stampede. Without a second thought, Ellen grabbed a heavy oilcloth coat from a peg and plunged into the storm. The rain hit her like a physical blow, soaking her hair and dress in seconds. The mud sucked at her boots, trying to pull her down. She saw Caleb, his face set in a grim line, trying to head off a group of calves that were running toward the open plains. "I'll help," she shouted over the wind. He looked at her, his eyes wide with surprise, but he didn't waste time arguing. He just nodded and pointed. "We need to turn them back toward the barn." They worked side by side in the churning mud and blinding rain. It was brutal, terrifying work. The cattle, panicked and strong, were a dangerous, unpredictable force. But there was a strange exhilaration in it, too. For the first time, Ellen was not a prisoner in a quiet house. She was part of a raw, desperate fight against the elements. She moved without thinking, her body responding to the primal urgency of the moment. She shouted. She waved her arms. She slipped and fell in the mud only to be pulled up by a strong hand. She and Caleb moved as a team, an unspoken rhythm developing between them. He would anticipate the herd's movement, and she would be there to block their path. As they struggled to force a stubborn steer back toward the gate, they both reached for its halter at the same time. In the slick, cold mud, their hands touched, his fingers, calloused and strong, brushed against hers. For a single, breathless moment, the roar of the storm faded away. There was only the shock of his touch, a jolt of warmth in the freezing rain. It was trembling, muddy, and utterly electrifying. She pulled her hand back as if burned, her heart leaping into her throat. He looked at her, his gray eyes dark and intense in the flashes of lightning. Neither of them spoke. They did not need to. In that one, fleeting touch, 1,000 unspoken words had passed between them. They worked until the last of the cattle were secured in the barn, soaked, shivering, and covered in mud. They stood for a moment in the relative quiet of the barn's entrance, the storm still raging behind them. Walter was nowhere to be seen. That night, sleep offered Caleb no peace. He dreamt of her. Not in the mud and the rain, but in a field of wildflowers he hadn't seen since he was a boy. She was smiling, a real genuine smile that reached her eyes and transformed her face. In the dream, he reached out to touch her hand, and there was no fear, no hesitation. There was only warmth and a profound sense of peace, a feeling of coming home that he hadn't known he was missing until that moment. He woke with a start, the dream dissolving into the cold, lonely darkness of the bunkhouse. Her name was on his lips, a whispered breath in the empty night. Ellen. A wave of shame washed over him. Shame for wanting something he could not have. Shame for dreaming of another man's wife. Shame for the weakness in his own heart that was threatening to drag them both down into a world of trouble. Ellen, too, lay awake in her cold bed. The feeling of his hand on hers lingered, a ghost of warmth on her skin. She pulled the wooden chest from under her bed and took out her journal and pencil. By the faint moonlight slanting through her window, she wrote, "A storm came tonight. It broke the fences, but for a few hours, I felt free. I do not know how much longer I can live in this house. I want to run, but the plains are so wide, there is nowhere to go." She closed the book, the words a stark admission of her own caged desperation. A few evenings later, she stood on the back porch, watching the sun set. It was a spectacular, violent display, the sky bleeding in streaks of crimson and orange, as if the day itself had been wounded. The beauty of it was sharp and painful. It was a beauty she could not share, a freedom she could not possess. She wrapped her arms around herself, a familiar gesture of self-protection, looking out at the blood-red horizon, at the endless empty land that was her prison. She whispered the deepest desire of her heart to the coming night. "I wish someone would take me away." She thought she was alone. She did not see the figure standing in the deep shadows behind the barn. Caleb Holt had been coming back from checking on a lame horse when he saw her silhouette against the fiery sky. He had stopped, unwilling to disturb her, and he had heard her, every broken, desperate word. The plea hung in the air between them, unheard by her, but a brand on his soul. He clenched his fists at his sides, the simple words of a stranger's wife sealing his fate as surely as if they had been his own. Caleb's whispered word, her name spoken into the darkness of the bunkhouse, had been a confession. Ellen's whispered plea, a wish for escape sent to the bleeding sunset, had been a prayer. Neither knew the other had spoken, but the words, once released, hung in the air between them, changing the very quality of the light, the taste of the dust, the sound of the ever-present wind. The space that separated them, once a measure of safety, was now a taut wire of unbearable tension. The change was felt in the smallest moments, which now swelled with a significance that was both terrifying and thrilling. At the long, silent supper table, the simple act of eating became an ordeal. Ellen would keep her eyes fixed on her plate, but she could feel his gaze from across the room, a steady, quiet presence. She would dare a glance, and her eyes would meet his. For a fraction of a second, the world would fall away, leaving only the two of them suspended in a silent acknowledgement of their shared secret. The spell would be broken by the harsh scrape of Walter's knife on his plate, a sound deliberately made, sharp and grating, a reminder of his power, of his ownership. Walter would be watching them, his eyes narrowed into suspicious slits, a predator sensing a rival in his territory. Passing a bucket of water by the well was no longer a simple chore. One morning, as she reached for the handle he was offering, their fingers brushed. It was a longer, more deliberate contact than the one in the storm. The calluses on his skin were a rough map of a hard life. Her skin was soft, a stark contrast. A jolt, sharp and clear as lightning, passed between them. She snatched her hand back, a faint blush rising on her cheeks. Caleb's jaw tightened, and he gave a curt nod before turning away, his movement stiff. The air crackled with the energy of their near touch, leaving them both shaken. They learned to communicate in the vast silences that defined life on the ranch. While she was hanging laundry on the line, he might be mending a fence nearby. No words were exchanged for an hour or more, yet she was profoundly aware of his every movement. His quiet competence was a comfort. His presence was a shield. The shared silence was more intimate than any conversation, a space where they could exist together without the need for pretense, both aware of the unspoken truth that bound them. Walter was not a stupid man. His intelligence was of a cunning, animalistic sort, finely tuned to threats against his dominance. He began to notice the subtle shifts in his wife's demeanor. The rigid fear that had defined her was now threaded with something else, a flicker of defiance, a deep-seated distraction that made her seem 1,000 miles away even when she was standing right in front of him. Her eyes would drift toward the yard. Her hands would still in their work. He saw where her gaze went. It went to the quiet, scarred cowboy named Holt. He started to test the man. Caleb was assigned the most brutal tasks, breaking the wildest horses, digging new post holes in the sun-baked earth until his hands bled, riding the longest, most dangerous fence lines alone. He was goaded and insulted in front of the other men, Walter's words dripping with a contempt meant to provoke a reaction. But Caleb never rose to the bait. He absorbed the work and the insults with a stoic calm that seemed to infuriate Walter even more. He did his job, his face a mask of indifference, but his eyes, when he looked at Ellen, held a protective fire that he could not entirely conceal, and Walter saw it. The simmering violence finally boiled over on a blistering hot morning. A young ranch hand, a boy of no more than 17 named Sam, had made a mistake. In his haste to get out of the oppressive sun, he had improperly secured the gate to the grain store. A few bushels had been lost to rats and weather. It was a trivial error, a matter of a few dollars. But for Walter, it was an act of disrespect, a challenge to his absolute authority. Ellen was in the kitchen, kneading dough, when she heard Walter's enraged roar. She rushed to the window, her heart seizing with a familiar dread. In the center of the yard, Walter stood over the cowering boy. He was holding a length of thick leather harness, and he raised it high. "This is my ranch," Walter bellowed, his voice carrying across the entire property. "My grain. You think you can steal from me, boy?" "No, sir, Mr. Briggs," Sam stammered, his face pale with terror. It was an accident. Accidents cost money! The harness whistled through the air and landed with a sickening thud across the boy's back. Sam cried out, stumbling to the ground. Ellen pressed her hands to her mouth, a silent scream trapped in her throat. The other ranch hands stood frozen, their heads bowed, their faces a mixture of fear and shame. None dared to move. To interfere was to invite Walter's wrath upon themselves. Walter raised the harness again, his face twisted in a mask of brutal satisfaction. But before it could fall, a hand shot out and caught his wrist. It was Caleb. "That's enough," Caleb said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the tense silence with the clean finality of a knife. Walter spun around, his eyes blazing with disbelief and fury. For a moment, he seemed too shocked to speak. "You!" he finally hissed, yanking his arm free. "You dare to lay a hand on me?" "The boy made a mistake. He's learned his lesson," Caleb said, his body positioned between Walter and the whimpering Sam on the ground. He did not raise his voice. He did not raise his fists. He simply stood there, an immovable object. That quiet defiance was more than Walter could tolerate. With a guttural snarl, he swung, not with the harness, but with his closed fist. The blow was fast and vicious, catching Caleb on the side of the mouth. Caleb staggered back a step, a dark line of blood instantly welling on his lip. He raised a hand to his mouth, his gray eyes never leaving Walter's, narrowed and cold. "You're a half step from being fired and a full step from being buried." "Halt!" Walter spat, his chest heaving. "Mind your place." He threw the harness to the ground, gave the boy Sam a final, contemptuous kick, and stormed toward the house. That night, the house was suffocating. Walter drank himself into a sullen stupor, the silence he radiated more menacing than any noise. Ellen moved on eggshells, her mind consumed by the image of Caleb standing bloody but unbowed in the yard. She waited until she was sure Walter was passed out in his chair, his snores rattling the windows. Then, cloaking herself in a dark shawl, she slipped out the back door. The air in the stable was warm and alive with the soft sounds of sleeping animals. The scent of hay and horse and well-worn leather was a comfort. She found him in an empty stall, dabbing at his split lip with a damp cloth by the light of a single, flickering lantern. He looked up as she approached, his body instantly tensing. "You shouldn't be here, missus," he said, his voice low and rough. "I saw what you did," she whispered, her hands twisting the fabric of her shawl. "For that boy, it was brave." "It was foolish," he countered, turning his face away from the light. "Got me nothing but a fat lip and a bad spot with the boss." "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. The words were small, but they carried the weight of everything else she could not say. "Thank you for not being like him. Thank you for being a good man. Thank you for making me feel like I am not entirely alone." He finally turned to look at her, and in the warm, dancing lantern light, she could see the truth in his eyes, the exhaustion, the loneliness, and something else, a deep and aching tenderness that made her breath catch in her throat. The air between them grew thick, charged with a potent mixture of fear and a longing so profound it was a physical pain. "I don't know how to keep living like this," she confessed, the words tumbling out of her in a broken whisper. It was the truest thing she had ever said. It was an admission of utter despair. Caleb looked at her for a long, silent moment. He saw the desperation in her eyes, the fine tremors in her hands. He saw a woman standing on the edge of a cliff, ready to fall. His own heart ached with a fierce, protective instinct that defied all logic and reason. "Then don't," he said quietly. The two words struck her with the force of a physical blow. It was not a plan, not a promise. It was permission. Permission to want more than this slow death she was living. Permission to believe that she did not have to endure the unendurable. In his simple, quiet statement, he was telling her that her life was her own, and she did not have to let Walter Briggs destroy it. Tears she hadn't even known she was holding back welled in her eyes, blurring his face. She took a half-step closer, drawn by a force she could no longer fight. He didn't move. He just watched her, his expression pained, his hands clenched at his sides. And then she was closing the last bit of distance between them. She raised a trembling hand to his face, her fingers gently touching the cut on his lip. He flinched slightly but did not pull away. He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch as if he were a man dying of thirst and she was a drop of rain. What happened next was as inevitable and as natural as the turning of the earth. He lowered his head, and she raised hers, and their lips met. The kiss was not soft or gentle. It was brief, desperate, and trembling with a year's worth of unspoken feelings. It tasted of blood and dust and the salt of her tears. It was a kiss of shared sorrow, of a fragile, dangerous hope. It was the desperate act of two drowning people clinging to the same piece of wreckage in a storm. The shock of it, the reality of what they had done, broke through the haze of emotion. Ellen pulled back abruptly, her eyes wide with terror. A gasp escaped her lips. She had just crossed a line from which there was no return. The stable, which had felt like a sanctuary moments before, now seemed like a trap, the shadows full of watching eyes. She could not stop trembling. Without another word, she turned and fled back into the suffocating darkness of the night. She slipped back into the house, her heart pounding a frantic, terrified rhythm against her ribs. But she was not careful enough. As she latched the kitchen door, a floorboard creaked upstairs. A shadow fell across the hallway. Walter stood at the top of the stairs, a half-empty bottle of whiskey in his hand. He said nothing. He did not have to. His eyes, burning with a cold, jealous fire in the gloom, saw her disheveled state, her wild eyes, her trembling lips. He saw her guilt. The next morning, he was icily calm. "You seem overtired." "Ellen," he said, his voice devoid of all emotion, "you will be staying in your room for a few days. To rest." He escorted her upstairs, the grip of his hand on her arm like a manacle. He opened the bedroom door, and when she was inside, she heard the heavy, final sound of a key turning in the lock. For 3 days, she was a prisoner in her own room. The world was reduced to what she could see through the single window. She watched the sun rise and set, painting the sky in colors she no longer found beautiful. She watched the ranch hands go about their work, their movements distant and unreal. 3 times a day, the cook would leave a tray of food outside her door, knocking once before hurrying away. The silence was a physical weight, pressing down on her, crushing her. Each night, when darkness fell, she would go to the window and watch the yard, and each night, he was there. Caleb would emerge from the bunkhouse long after the other men were asleep. He would walk to the water trough, the same spot where she had first seen him, and he would stand there, a dark, motionless silhouette in the moonlight. He wasn't looking at the horizon. He was looking at her window. He was standing vigil. He was making sure she was still alive. On the 3rd night, a wave of despair so powerful it nearly brought her to her knees washed over her. Walter could keep her locked in here forever. He could starve her. He could break her, piece by piece, until nothing was left. The only thing that stood between her and that fate was the silent, watchful man in the yard below. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass of the window pane, her breath fogging the surface. Tears streamed down her face, hot and silent. He could not hear her. She knew, but she had to say it. The words were a prayer, a plea, a command, torn from the deepest, most terrified part of her soul. "Don't leave me with him," she whispered, her voice breaking on a sob. Down below, in the silver moonlight, Caleb could not possibly have heard the words, but he saw her shape at the window. He saw the faint glint of tears on the glass. He felt the force of her desperation reaching across the dark, empty space between them. And as if in answer to her unspoken plea, His hands, which had been hanging loosely at his sides, slowly clenched into tight, white-knuckled fists. In that moment, a plan was born. It had no words, no details. It was an unspoken covenant, forged in the crucible of her imprisonment and his helpless rage. It was a dangerous, desperate thing, born of a whispered plea and a silent vow. He would not leave her, and she would not let Walter Briggs be the end of her story. The silent promise made across the dark yard could not hold back the cold light of day. For Caleb Holt, dawn brought with it a harsh and undeniable clarity. He was a drifter, a man who survived by knowing when to move on. He had seen men like Walter Briggs before, men whose pride was a brittle, venomous thing. To stay now, after what had passed between him and Ellen, was not bravery. It was suicide. Briggs's suspicion was a loaded gun, and it was pointed squarely at Caleb's head. He made the decision before the sun had fully crested the horizon. He would take his pay and be gone before noon. He would ride west, lose himself in the territories, and forget the haunted eyes of a woman he had no right to care about. It was the only sane choice. He lay on his thin mattress in the bunkhouse, listening to the snores of the other men, and planned his escape, the taste of ash in his mouth. Walter unlocked Ellen's door that morning. He did not speak to her. He simply turned the key and walked away, leaving the door agape. The act was one of supreme arrogance, a declaration that even with the door open, she was still his prisoner. She waited until she heard his heavy boots descend the stairs before she crept out, her body aching from days of confinement and a gnawing, ever-present fear. Her first thought was of Caleb. She had to know if he was still there. She found him by the corral, checking the hooves of his horse, a big roan that had the same restless, lonely look as its owner. His saddlebags were already strapped in place. The sight struck her with a cold, physical shock. He was leaving. "Caleb," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He straightened up slowly, not turning to face her at first. He had been so lost in the grim necessity of his plan that he hadn't heard her approach. When he finally looked at her, his face was a mask of stone, his gray eyes guarded and pained. "You're leaving," she stated, the words flat and hollow. It was not a question. "It's for the best," he said, his voice low and rough. "He knows, or he suspects enough. If I stay, he'll kill me, and he'll take it out on you." Everything he said was logical. It was true, but the truth offered no comfort. All she could feel was the floor of her world crumbling away, leaving her suspended over a terrifying abyss. The silent vigil he had kept at her window had been a lifeline, and now he was preparing to cut it. "You can't," she begged, taking a step closer. The carefully constructed walls of her composure shattered, revealing the raw desperation beneath. "You can't go. Please." "Ellen, there's no other way," he said, his voice strained. He finally looked her full in the face, and she saw the torment in his eyes. This was tearing him apart, too. "You don't understand," she said, her voice breaking. Tears she had sworn she would not shed began to trace paths through the dust on her cheeks. "If you leave me here with him, I can't survive it. I won't. He'll break what's left of me. Please, Caleb, don't leave me alone." Her plea struck him harder than Walter's fist ever could. It dismantled all his carefully constructed reasons, all his logic for survival. He had spent his life running, from a past he never spoke of and a future he never believed he would have. But looking at her now, at her tear-streaked face and the fierce, desperate hope in her eyes, he knew he could not run from this. Leaving would save his life, but it would condemn his soul. "Tonight," he said, his voice barely audible over the rising wind. "When the moon is high, meet me by the riverbank, down past the cottonwoods. We need to talk where no one can see or hear us." The river was a thin, silver ribbon that cut through the vast, dark expanse of the plains. It was the only place on the Briggs ranch that felt truly alive. The soft murmur of the water, a gentle counterpoint to the harsh, ceaseless wind. The moonlight was kinder here, filtering through the rustling leaves of the cottonwood trees, softening the hard edges of the world and of their fear. Ellen came to him like a ghost, a pale figure gliding through the shadows. She was trembling when she reached him, from the night chill and from a terror so profound it was a physical ailment. He took her hands in his. They were cold as ice. "He'll kill us if he finds us," she whispered, her eyes scanning the darkness around them. "He'll kill us if we do nothing," Caleb answered, his voice grim. He led her to the shelter of a large, overhanging rock by the water's edge, a place of deep shadow that hid them from the open plain. For a long time, they just stood there, holding hands in the darkness, the silence stretching between them. There were no easy answers to be found here. They were trapped. If they ran, they would be hunted. A runaway wife and a wanted ranch hand would find no sanctuary in the West. If they stayed, they would live under the constant, murderous threat of Walter's jealousy. "My father sold me," Ellen said suddenly, her voice flat and distant as she stared at the shimmering water. "He sold me to save a patch of dirt. I'm just another piece of property. If I run, Walter will see it as theft. He will hunt me down not because he loves me, but because I am his." Caleb's grip on her hand tightened. "You are not property, Ellen." "Aren't I?" she asked, a bitter smile touching her lips. "My life is not my own. It hasn't been since the day I said I do." She looked at him then, her eyes luminous with unshed tears in the moonlight. "That night in the stable, after the kiss, I was so scared, but I was also alive. For the first time in so long, I felt alive." He raised his free hand and gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek. His touch was hesitant, reverent. "I'm the one who should be sorry," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I put you in more danger. I had no right." "You have been the only kindness in this whole desolate place," she whispered. "You are the only thing that has kept me from giving up entirely." The space between them vanished. It was not a conscious decision, but a gravitational pull, an overwhelming need that eclipsed all fear, all reason. His arms went around her, pulling her close, and she buried her face in his chest, breathing in the scent of him, leather, dust, and something uniquely his own, something that smelled like safety. He held her tightly, as if he could physically shield her from all the cruelty in the world. This was more than a kiss, more than a touch in the dark. It was a desperate, frantic search for solace. It was two lonely, broken people finding a moment of grace in a world that had offered them none. Their movements were tender but trembling, born of a desire that was inextricably tangled with sorrow and fear. They knew this was a stolen moment, a single, perfect night that might be the only one they would ever have. This was not the beginning of a life together. It was a beautiful, heartbreaking farewell to the lives they could never lead, in the soft shelter of the riverbank, under the silent watch of the moon. They gave in to the impossible, finding in each other's arms a fleeting, desperate sanctuary against the coming dawn. The cold light of morning was a brutal intrusion. Ellen slipped back into the house before the first rooster crowed, her heart a tangled mess of new, terrifying love and old, familiar dread. She felt branded by the night, by Caleb's touch, certain that her secret was written all over her face. She was right. When she came down to the kitchen, Walter was waiting for her. He was not in his usual chair at the head of the table. He was standing by the back door, his large frame blocking the morning light. He was holding something in his hand. It was a clod of damp earth, perfectly shaped by the heel of a woman's boot. He had found the footprints leading from her window toward the river. He did not speak. He did not have to. He simply looked at her, and his face was a mask of such quiet, concentrated rage that it stole the very breath from her lungs. His eyes were cold and dead, but a fire burned deep within them, a promise of a violence so profound it would leave no visible marks, only a shattered soul. He held up the clump of dirt, then let it crumble through his fingers. the grains falling to the floor like the last seconds of her life. From the yard, Caleb saw it all. He had been waiting, his stomach in knots, watching the house. He saw Walter on the porch. He saw Ellen's face, pale and stricken. He saw the silent, terrible confrontation. His hand went instinctively to the knife on his belt, but he was too far away. There was nothing he could do. Walter's hand shot out, grabbing Ellen's upper arm in a vice-like grip. He did not drag her kicking and screaming. The horror was in the quiet, inexorable way he pulled her back inside the house, her feet stumbling to keep up. Caleb watched, frozen and helpless, as the heavy oak door swung shut. The sharp, final sound of the bolt sliding home echoed across the yard, a death knell. That night, Caleb packed his horse. He did it with a grim, methodical slowness. He rolled his bedroll, filled his canteen, checked the cinch on his saddle. He was going to ride away. To stay was madness. Briggs would kill him now. Without a doubt, he had to save himself. He led his horse out of the barn and swung himself into the saddle. He pointed the roan west, toward the dark, open plains, toward freedom. He kicked his heels, and the horse took a single, lurching step. And then he stopped. He could not do it. The image of Ellen's terrified face, of Walter's quiet rage, of the door closing between them, was seared into his mind. He could not leave her. He would rather die here, fighting for her, than live a long life as a coward who had run away. He dismounted, his movements stiff with anguish. Tying the horse to the corral fence, he walked back to his place, his vigil beneath her darkened window. He stood there all night, a solitary statue of torment, torn apart by a choice that had no right answer. He waited for a sign, for a sound, for anything. But the house remained dark and silent. He waited until the first gray fingers of dawn began to pry the night sky open. The front door opened shortly after sunrise. Walter emerged, dressed for a trip to town. He moved with a stiff, deliberate gait, his face set and grim. A few moments later, Ellen came out. Walter had sent her to fetch something from the smokehouse. Caleb's heart stopped. A dark, ugly bruise bloomed on her left cheek, spreading up toward her temple. Her lip was swollen, and she moved with a pained slowness, her eyes downcast, fixed on the ground in front of her. She looked smaller, more fragile than ever, as if something essential inside of her had been broken. The sight filled Caleb with a white-hot rage that was so intense it made him dizzy. All his indecision, all his fear, burned away in that moment, leaving behind only a cold, hard certainty. She had to pass near the corrals on her way to the smokehouse. As she drew near, she kept her head down, not daring to look at him. But as she passed the spot where his horse was tied, she stumbled, her hand flying out to brace herself against his saddle. It was over in a second. She righted herself and hurried on, never breaking her stride. It was only after she had disappeared inside the smokehouse that he saw it. Tucked into the leather strap of his saddlebag was a tiny, folded piece of paper. His fingers trembled as he pulled it free. He unfolded it. The pencil scratching was faint and hurried. The words of a ghost. "If I survive tonight, I'll run. Wait by the cottonwoods." The sun began its descent, painting the western sky in streaks of blood red and violent purple. It was the kind of sunset that promised a storm, a reckoning. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of rain that had not yet fallen and the familiar, gritty scent of dust. It was the smell of the end of the world. From his vantage point in the barn, Caleb saw Walter's wagon returning from town. He was early, far too early. He watched as Walter reined in the horses, his movements clumsy and overly aggressive. He stumbled down from the wagon seat, a bottle of whiskey in one hand. Tucked into the waistband of his trousers was the familiar, ominous shape of his pistol. He was drunk, suspicious, and armed. Caleb's hand went to the note in his pocket. "If I survive tonight." Inside the main house, Ellen heard the wagon. She heard Walter's heavy, unsteady footsteps on the porch. She had been lying on her bed, fully clothed, staring at the ceiling, waiting. The moment had come. With a slow, deliberate movement, she reached under her pillow. Her fingers closed around the cold, smooth handle of the small paring knife she had stolen from the kitchen. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was all she had, and she would use it. She would not die without a fight. The house was a tinderbox, saturated with years of unspoken rage and silent despair, waiting for a spark. Walter Briggs was that spark. He kicked the front door open with a splintering crash, his drunken fury a palpable force that rolled through the downstairs rooms. Ellen, upstairs in her bedroom, heard the sound and her blood ran cold. The paring knife in her hand felt impossibly small, a child's toy against the monstrous rage that was coming for her. She heard him on the stairs, his footsteps heavy and uneven. He was not just walking, he was hunting. "Ellen!" he roared, the name a raw, ugly sound torn from his throat. "Where is the whore? Where is my cheating wife?" She scrambled to her feet, her small wooden chest clutched in her other hand. The plan, if it could be called that, had been to wait until he was asleep, to slip out her window and run. But there was no time for that now. He was at the top of the stairs, a lumbering shadow of menace. He saw her then, standing in the doorway of her room, fully dressed, holding the chest. It was all the proof his whiskey-soaked mind needed. "Running?" he sneered, a terrible, joyless smile twisting his lips. "Running to him? Did you think I would not know? Did you think I would let you?" He lunged for her. She tried to dart past him, but he was too quick. His hand clamped down on her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like talons. The wooden chest fell from her grasp, scattering its meager contents, a few worn dresses, a bone comb, across the floorboards. He saw the glint of metal in her other hand. His eyes narrowed on the small knife. He laughed, a short, barking sound of contempt. "You would raise a blade to me, in my own house?" The struggle was a frantic, terrifying blur. He was a mountain of muscle and rage, and she was a willow branch in a hurricane. He wrenched the knife from her hand, the blade slicing a shallow cut across her palm. He threw her against the wall, the impact knocking the wind from her lungs. She saw his face above hers, contorted with a hatred that was beyond human. His hands went to her throat. As his fingers tightened, her world began to shrink, the edges darkening. A primal instinct for survival, fierce and desperate, surged through her. She fought back, scratching at his face, kicking at his legs. It was useless, but in their violent, clumsy dance, her flailing hand connected with the handle of the paring knife, which had fallen to the floor beside them. Her fingers closed around it. She didn't aim. She didn't think. She just lunged upward with all the strength she had left, a silent scream of terror and defiance trapped in her chest. The knife, so small and inadequate, found its mark. She felt a sickening resistance, then a giving way. Walter let out a strangled cry of shock and pain. He stumbled backward, his hands leaving her throat. He looked down at the handle of the knife protruding from his side, just below his ribs, a look of stunned disbelief on his face. He looked at her, his eyes wide, and then he crumpled to the floor. That was the moment the shot rang out. Not from Walter's gun, but from outside. A deafening blast as Caleb, maddened by Walter's roar and the sounds of the struggle, fired his own pistol at the front door lock. The wood around the knob exploded inward. A second later, the door crashed open and Caleb burst into the house, his gun raised, his face a pale mask of terror. He took the stairs 2 at a time and skidded to a halt at the scene in the upstairs hallway. Walter was on the floor, groaning, a dark stain spreading across his shirt, and Ellen was pressed against the far wall, her dress torn, her body shaking with violent, uncontrollable tremors. Her hands were covered in blood. Caleb's eyes took in the scene in a fraction of a second. Walter was alive, but injured. Ellen was in shock. The bloody author of the deed, His mind raced, instinct taking over. He had to protect her. He moved toward her, his voice low and urgent. "Give me the knife," he said, but the knife was already on the floor. He knelt, about to pick it up. "Listen to me, Ellen. He came at me. I was in the house. He found me, and we fought. You had nothing to do with this, do you understand?" He was creating the story, taking the blame, building a wall around her with a desperate lie. No. The word was quiet, but it cut through the charged air with absolute finality. Caleb froze, looking at her. She was still shaking, but her eyes were clear. The fear was still there, but beneath it was a new and unfamiliar hardness, like bedrock revealed by a flood. "No," she said again, her voice stronger now. She pushed herself off the wall, standing on her own 2 feet. "He came for me. He tried to kill me. I did this." She looked down at the blood on her hands, not with horror, but with a strange, grim acceptance. "I'm done being afraid of him. I'm done being afraid of anyone." On the floor, Walter's groan turned into a guttural snarl. With a surge of adrenaline and pure hatred, he pushed himself up onto one elbow. His hand fumbled at his waistband, pulling free the heavy pistol. The other ranch hands would have heard the shot. They would be coming. His reputation, his authority. It was all bleeding out onto the floorboards, and it was all because of the man standing over his wife. He raised the gun, the barrel shaking, and aimed it at Caleb's heart. "You," he wheezed, his face a ghastly shade of gray. Time seemed to slow. Ellen saw the gun, the murderous intent in her husband's dying eyes. She opened her mouth to scream. Caleb moved to shove her behind him. But the shot never came. A final, shuddering tremor racked Walter's body. The last of the life went out of his eyes, leaving them dull and empty. The gun slipped from his slack fingers, clattering onto the floor with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden, absolute silence. He was dead. The silence was broken by the sound of shouting from the yard. The ranch hands were coming. "We have to go," Caleb said, grabbing her arm. "Now." The next hour was a frantic blur. They fled before the first ranch hand reached the house, slipping out the back and running for the stables. Caleb saddled his roan and another sturdy mare, his hands moving with an efficiency born of a lifetime of quick departures. They stuffed saddlebags with whatever they could find, a loaf of bread and some dried meat from the pantry, 2 canteens of water, a bedroll. They rode out not on the main trail, but across the open plains, heading east toward the rising sun and the unforgiving. Empty lands where the law was thin and shelter was scarce. They rode until the horses were lathered and their own bodies screamed with exhaustion. When they looked back, they could see the faint, flickering lights of lanterns spreading out from the ranch house. A spider's web of pursuit. They were being hunted. Their escape was a descent into a brutal, elemental world. The West was no longer a landscape. It was a relentless adversary. For 2 days, a sandstorm descended upon them, a roaring, blinding wall of grit that scoured the land and the sky. They huddled in the shallow lee of a rock outcropping, their bodies pressed together for warmth. A rough blanket pulled over their heads. The wind howled like a legion of ghosts, and the sand filled their eyes, their mouths, their very lungs. When the storm finally passed, the world was a featureless, alien landscape, and they had no idea if they had covered their tracks or simply lost themselves completely. Hunger became a constant, gnawing companion. The bread and meat were gone in 2 days. They subsisted on what little Caleb could hunt, a scrawny rabbit, a tough old jackal, and the bitter roots of desert plants. Fear was their shadow, their bedfellow. Every distant dust cloud was a posse. Every stranger's campfire was a threat. They rode by night and hid during the day, sleeping in short, fitful bursts, one always on watch while the other collapsed into a dreamless exhaustion. Ellen learned to handle a gun, to read the signs of the land, to live with the constant, metallic taste of fear in her mouth. She and Caleb spoke little, their energy saved for survival, but their reliance on each other became a bond stronger than any spoken words. He was her strength, her guide, and she was his purpose, his reason to keep moving. After what felt like a lifetime, when they were on the verge of collapse, their water gone and their hopes dwindling, they saw it. Nestled in the foothills of a small, unnamed mountain range was the dark, skeletal shape of a building. It was an old, abandoned trapper's cabin, its roof sagging, its door hanging from a single hinge. To them, it was a palace. Inside, it was small and dark, smelling of dust and decay. But it had 4 walls, a stone hearth, and a roof that mostly kept the wind out. It was shelter. It was safety. And now that she was safe, the walls Ellen had built around her heart to survive the flight finally crumbled. She looked around the tiny, squalid cabin, at Caleb's exhausted face, at her own ragged clothes and filthy hands, and the full, crushing weight of what they had done, of what had been done to her, came crashing down. She began to shake, the tremors starting in her hands and spreading through her entire body. A low, wounded sound escaped her lips. "It's my fault," she whispered, her voice raw. "All of it. Walter. The running. You. You should have left when you could. I've cursed you. Caleb." She slid down the rough-hewn wall to the floor, pulling her knees to her chest, her body racked with dry, hitching sobs. It was a storm of grief and guilt and terror. A release of all the pain she had held inside for so long. She believed it with every fiber of her being. She was a curse, a bringer of ruin. Caleb was beside her in an instant. He didn't offer empty platitudes or easy comforts. He simply knelt in the dirt floor and wrapped his arms around her, pulling her tightly against his chest. He held her as the storm broke, weathering her sobs, her whispered accusations against herself, her raw, unfiltered despair. He just held on, a solid, unmoving anchor in her chaotic sea of pain. When the worst of it had passed, and her sobs had quieted to exhausted shudders, he gently pushed her back so he could see her face. His own eyes were full of a fierce, unwavering tenderness. "You are not a curse, Ellen," he said, his voice low and firm. "You are a survivor. Everything that happened back there, that was his doing, not yours." He brushed the tears and dust from her cheeks with his thumb. "And I'm not leaving you. I'm never leaving you again, I promise." In the days that followed, the small, broken-down cabin became their world. A fragile peace settled over them. They worked together, falling into a domestic rhythm that felt both strange and deeply natural. He taught her how to set snares, and she showed him which wild greens were safe to eat. They gathered water from a small, clear spring they found higher in the foothills. He patched the worst of the holes in the roof with mud and pine boughs, and she swept the dirt floor and made a mattress of soft fir branches in the corner. As the weather turned colder, the first snows of winter began to dust the peaks of the mountains. They spent the long, cold nights huddled together under a single thin blanket in front of a small, crackling fire. They slept in each other's arms, a habit born of a need for warmth that quickly became a need for comfort, for closeness. In the quiet darkness of the cabin, with the snow falling silently outside, they were not fugitives. They were just a man and a woman, scarred and scared, but together. For a few fleeting, precious weeks, they lived as husband and wife, carving out a small, secret life on the edge of the world. But the world does not forget. One afternoon, Caleb returned from checking his snares, his face grim. He had seen a rider in the valley below, a man wearing the badge of a territorial marshal, asking questions of a prospector panning for gold in a nearby stream. Whispers of a murdered rancher, a wealthy and powerful man, had finally traveled this far. The name Briggs had been carried on the wind, a bounty attached to it. The peace was shattered. The cabin was no longer a sanctuary. It was a trap. A posse was hunting them, and the world was shrinking once more. The fragile peace of their mountain sanctuary was shattered by the dawn. It came not with the gentle warmth of the rising sun, but with the cold, hard glint of light on a rifle barrel. Caleb saw them first, dark figures on horseback, materializing on the ridgetops that surrounded the cabin, their silhouettes stark and menacing against the pale morning sky. They were a silent, inescapable net, drawing tight around their small, stolen world. "Ellen, wake up," he said, his voice low and urgent. "They're here." She was awake in an instant, the peaceful exhaustion of sleep replaced by a jolt of pure adrenaline. She looked out the small, grimy window and saw what he saw. The posse. They were not charging, not shouting. They were simply there, a patient, methodical circle of men and horses, their presence a quiet promise of an end. Their escape was a desperate, hopeless scramble. They burst from the back of the cabin, running toward the thick woods that climbed the foothills, their only chance a prayer of reaching cover before they were seen. But the men were professionals. A sharp whistle cut through the thin mountain air, and 2 more riders appeared from the trees ahead, blocking their path. They were surrounded. Caleb stopped, pulling Ellen behind him. He slowly raised his hands, the gesture of surrender a bitter taste in his mouth. He had a pistol tucked in his belt, but there were at least a dozen men, all with rifles aimed. A gunfight would be a massacre, and Ellen would be caught in the middle. His only priority now was to keep her alive. "We give up," he shouted, his voice echoing in the quiet morning. "Don't shoot!"
"No!"
Ellen whispered fiercely from behind him, her hand grabbing his arm.
"Caleb, no!"
"It's over, Ellen," he said, his eyes still fixed on the grim-faced marshal who was now riding toward them. "There's no other way."
"I won't let them,"
she said, her voice shaking but laced with a core of unbending steel. She stepped out from behind him, to stand beside him, her head held high. "I didn't survive Walter Briggs just to watch you hang from a tree. I won't lose you to a rope after all we've endured." Her refusal was not a plea, but a declaration. It was the final, defiant act of a woman who would no longer be a pawn in her own fate. She would not let him make a noble sacrifice that would leave her alone once more. Whatever was coming, they would face it together. The journey back to Redemption Gulch was a grim, silent procession. They were bound at the wrists and led on horseback, the center of a heavily armed convoy. The town they entered was not the one they had fled. Word had spread, and the dusty street was lined with curious, hostile faces. They were murderers, adulterers, thieves of property and life. The whispers followed them like carrion birds. They were not given a trial by jury. Justice in these parts was swift and often brutal. They were brought before a traveling circuit judge, a weary, gray-haired man who convened court in the saloon, the smell of stale beer and sawdust a strange backdrop for a matter of life and death. The marshal laid out the facts. Walter Briggs, a wealthy and respected rancher, found dead in his own home. His wife and a hired hand, Caleb Holt, fled the same night. The evidence was overwhelming. The judge looked at Caleb, his eyes hard. "In the murder of a landowner, the penalty is death by hanging. Do you have anything to say for yourself, son?" Before Caleb could speak his lie, the lie he had prepared to save her, Ellen's clear voice rang out in the crowded room. He had nothing to do with it. All eyes turned to her. She stood before the judge, her hands bound in front of her, her face bruised and exhausted, but her gaze was steady and unwavering. "Walter Briggs was my husband," she began, her voice gaining strength with every word. "He was also my jailer. For months, he controlled my every move, my every word. He was a cruel man, whose temper was a constant threat to my life. The night he died, he had returned from town, drunk and armed. He had locked me in my room for days prior, and when he found me that night, he accused me of trying to run. He attacked me." She paused, taking a breath, letting the silent, stunned room hang on her words. "He tried to kill me. He had his hands around my throat. I fought back because I wanted to live. I did not mean to kill him. only to stop him. It was my hand that held the knife. Caleb Holt was not even in the house. He heard the commotion and broke down the door. He found me only after Walter was already on the floor. He is guilty of nothing more than trying to help a woman he saw being abused. I am the one you want." Her confession was so raw, so honest, that it sucked the very air from the room. It was the truth, and everyone there knew it. The judge looked from her resolute face to Caleb's tormented one. He sighed, a deep, weary sound. "The law is a blunt instrument, ma'am," he said, his voice softer now. "A wife's testimony of abuse is a difficult thing to weigh against the life of her husband. But your confession regarding Mr. Holt is clear. He is to be released for lack of evidence." He banged his gavel once. Then he looked at Ellen, his expression a mixture of pity and duty. "For the death of Walter Briggs. However, I am bound by that same law. Given the circumstances you have described, I will not sentence you to hang, but you will be remanded to the territorial prison. The sentence is 20 years. The night before the prison train was scheduled to arrive, Caleb was allowed to see her. He found her in a small, barred cell at the back of the marshal's office. A single, high window let in a sliver of moonlight. She was sitting on a narrow cot, her hands folded in her lap. She looked small and terribly fragile. He knelt in front of her, taking her cuffed hands in his. There were no words for the chasm of grief and injustice that lay between them. 20 years, Ellen," he whispered, his voice thick with unshed tears. "It's a lifetime." "It is not a rope," she answered, her voice quiet. "You are free. Caleb, that is all that matters." "I'll wait for you," he said, his grip on her hands tightening. "I swear to you, I will wait. No matter how long it takes, I will be there when you get out." A faint, sad smile touched her lips. She looked at their joined hands, then up at his face. "You shouldn't," she said softly. "Look at me. Look at the ruin I have made. Of my life, of yours. I do not deserve that kind of love. I do not deserve you." He reached up and gently touched her bruised cheek, his heart aching with a love so fierce it was a physical pain. "Ellen, listen to me," he said, his voice raw with an intensity that made her meet his eyes. "Before I met you, I was nothing, just a ghost, drifting from one place to the next, with no past and no future. You gave me a reason. You gave my life a purpose. You think you brought me ruin?" He shook his head, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on his cheek. "You were my salvation." The years passed, as they always do, indifferent to the sorrows of men. The seasons turned, and the West changed. Railroads cut across the plains, and new towns sprang up like weeds. Caleb Holt drifted north, leaving the arid lands of his past behind. He ended up in Montana, a place of wide green valleys, towering mountains, and a sky so vast it seemed to hold all the promises the rest of the world had broken. He was no longer a drifter. He took a job as a senior hand on a large cattle ranch owned by a fair man named Abernathy. He worked hard, his quiet competence earning him respect. He was given his own small cabin on the property, a simple, sturdy structure that he kept meticulously clean. He was a solitary man, but not an unfriendly one. He spoke when spoken to, and his words were few but thoughtful. The other hands knew he had a past, a story he never told, but they respected his silence. He was just Holt, the steady hand who seemed to be waiting for something. His only true possession was a letter. It was the one letter she had been allowed to write him. A year into her sentence, the paper was worn soft as linen, the folds so deep they were almost tears. He kept it wrapped in an oilcloth in his breast pocket. He knew the words by heart, but sometimes, on lonely nights, he would light a lamp and read them again, his fingers tracing the faint, delicate script. "My dearest Caleb, they tell me the sky is blue today. I see it only in my mind. I spend my days thinking of you. I hope you have found peace somewhere. I hope you are not waiting, but if I ever see the open sky again, I will come find you. Yours, Ellen. 10 years. 10 years of seasons, of hard work, of silence, and of waiting. He was a different man now. His hair threaded with gray at the temples, the lines on his face carved deeper by sun and time. The fire of his youth had banked into a low, steady ember of patience. It was a bright spring morning. The air was crisp and smelled of new grass and melting snow. Caleb was out by the main road, mending a section of fence that had been damaged by the winter drifts. It was quiet, peaceful work. He heard the familiar rumble and jingle of the weekly stagecoach as it made its way up the valley toward the main ranch house. It was a common sight, bringing mail and the occasional visitor. He barely glanced at it as he continued to twist the wire tight. The stagecoach slowed, and then, unusually, it stopped right beside him. He paused his work, a flicker of curiosity stirring. The driver tipped his hat. "Got a passenger for this ranch." "Halt!" The door creaked open, and a woman stepped down onto the dusty road. She was wearing a plain, dark dress and a simple bonnet that shadowed her face. She carried a small, worn carpet bag in one hand. She looked tired, as if she had been traveling for a very long time. Caleb stood up straight, wiping his hands on his trousers. A new hand for the cookhouse, perhaps. He started to walk toward her, ready to offer a polite greeting. The woman lifted her head, and the sunlight fell upon her face. He froze. The world, which had been moving forward second by second for 10 long years, came to a dead stop. The sound of the wind, the cry of a distant hawk, the jingle of the harness, it all faded into a deafening silence. It was her. She was older. The youthful softness was gone from her face, replaced by fine lines around her eyes and mouth. There was gray in the hair that peeked out from under her bonnet. She was thinner, and her eyes held the weariness of a decade of lost time. But they were shining, and they were fixed on him. She took a hesitant step forward, then another. The stagecoach driver, sensing he was witnessing something profound, quietly flicked his reins and drove on, leaving them alone on the empty road. She stopped a few feet from him, the small bag dropping from her fingers to the ground. 1,000 emotions washed over her face. Disbelief, fear, and a hope so fragile it was almost painful to see. She whispered his name, a sound he had only heard in his dreams for 10 years. Then, her voice trembling, she said the words he had both longed for and despaired of ever hearing. "You waited." He could not find his voice for a moment. He could only look at her, drinking in the impossible, beautiful sight of her. The woman he thought he might never see again was standing right in front of him, under the wide, open Montana sky. When he finally spoke, his voice was a quiet rasp, but it held all the truth of the last 10 years, and all the promise of the rest of their lives. "I never left." He closed the distance between them, and she met him halfway. They did not rush. It was a slow, deliberate coming together, a closing of a circle that had been broken for a decade. His hand found hers, her fingers lacing through his as if they had been made to fit there. They stood like that for a long time, just holding hands on the side of the road, the silence between them full of everything that had been lost and everything that was now, finally, found. Then, together, hand in hand, they turned and began to walk away from the road, toward the open fields and the small, quiet cabin that was waiting to become a home. The vast western sky arched above them, a boundless expanse of blue. They were both scarred, both weathered by the cruelties of the world. But they were free, they were together, and they were, at long last, home. Thank you for being part of our journey through this story. Let us know where you are listening from in the comments to connect with fellow fans. And be sure to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.